The Appalachian Mountains had always held a certain allure for George Johnson. Their rolling peaks, dense forests, and hidden trails called to him, offering an escape from the heat of Austin's concrete sprawl. As a delivery driver, his days were spent navigating city traffic and listening to the grumble of engines. Hiking was his reprieve, a silent contrast to the roar of his daily life. Spring brought the mountain laurel into bloom, and with it, George's yearning for solitude among the trees. He planned a hike that would take him deep into the forest, past streams that whispered secrets, and under a canopy thick with the scent of wet earth. The forecast called for clouds, but that suited him fine. It kept the sun's glare off his back and added a misty veil to the path ahead. It was on the third mile when the silence broke. A sharp, guttural snarl echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, the kind that seemed to resonate not just in his ears, but in his bones. George froze, fingers tightening around the handle of the hunting knife strapped to his side. His breath stilled, and he listened. The birds had gone quiet, the only sound now the rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze. A childhood spent camping with his father in the Texas hill country had given him a healthy respect for wild animals. But this noise was different, more deliberate. He swallowed, taking a step forward, only to hear the distinct crack of a branch breaking behind him. Whipping around, George's eyes scanned the forest, trying to pierce through the shifting shades of green and brown. That's when he saw it, a shadow too tall to be a deer, too broad to be a bear. It stood partially hidden behind an ancient oak, eyes glinting like polished coins. Dogman. The name came unbidden, a whisper from the corners of his mind, where campfire stories and online articles had lodged like splinters. Back in Austin, George had spent restless nights reading about cryptid sightings. Stories of strange creatures with canine features and the gait of a man haunted the rural corners of America, with sightings most often traced to dense, uncharted forests. The Dogman, a name repeated by both skeptics and believers, was described as feral, calculating, and fiercely territorial. The shadow didn't move, but its eyes tracked him as he slowly stepped backward, each movement deliberate, measured. The thudding of his heart filled his ears, a drumbeat urging him to flee. But he knew better. Running would only make him prey. By the time the light had started to wane, the clouds thickened, casting a dusky glow over the forest. George reached a clearing and decided it was safer to stay put, rather than stumble blind through an unknown trail. He gathered dry twigs and branches, the snap of each one sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. Soon, a fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the trees. He sat close, the knife resting beside him, his eyes darting from the fire to the darkness beyond. The wind picked up, whistling a mournful tune through the trees, and with it came the sound again, a low, guttural growl, this time circling the edge of the clearing. George's skin prickled, every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. The fire's light caught movement, a flash of fur, a shift in the dark that resolved into a shape. It was hunched, its limbs grotesquely long, its snout raised as if tasting the air. Memories flooded him, his father's easy laughter, the warm glow of their family's old kitchen, the way his mother always kept a light on, just in case. He longed for that light now, something steady to anchor him against the shifting shadows. The creature let out a noise, half growl, half laughter, and George felt a shiver course down his spine. He gripped the knife tighter and, for a moment, considered the flare gun in his pack, a last resort. Time passed in a tense, surreal loop. The creature circled, its eyes never straying from him, yet it didn't attack. The wind began to chill, seeping into his bones as the night stretched on. George tried to think of anything but the glint of those eyes, or the way they seemed to follow the dancing light of the fire. Morning broke slowly, the gray light spreading through the trees, dispersing the shadows inch by inch. When George finally dared to move, stiff and aching from a night spent on high alert, the creature had gone, leaving behind only a faint impression in the damp earth where it had stood. He wasted no time packing up, his hands trembling as he doused the fire and secured his gear. The path out was rough, his boots catching on roots and stones as he stumbled forward. Every snap of a twig sent his pulse racing, but the forest remained silent, watchful. A few miles from the clearing, George reached a fork in the trail and spotted a narrow dirt road winding its way toward a village. Relief surged through him, almost bringing him to his knees. As he crossed into the open, the tension finally released its grip, leaving him exhausted and hollow. When he reached the town, he considered telling someone, calling the police maybe. But as he saw the faces of the locals, heard their easy chatter, he held back. What could he say that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a madman? Instead, he sank onto a bench outside a general store, the weight of the night pressing down on him. As the first rays of the sun broke through the morning clouds, George looked back at the tree line. The forest, ancient and indifferent, seemed to sigh in the light. He knew he wouldn't speak of the dogman, not to anyone, but the knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a reminder that the old stories sometimes had teeth. The Maine woods had always intrigued Arthur Starsky. Thick, shadowed, and teeming with life, they reminded him of the winding back roads of Poughkeepsie, where he grew up. In both places, there was a sense of things lurking just beyond sight, waiting to reveal themselves. Arthur's job as a trucker had given him a certain appreciation for solitude, but it was the thrill of the unknown that had drawn him to the hunting trip this summer. The group, Arthur and 3 friends, had driven deep into the heart of the wilderness. The air smelled of pine and damp moss, and a fresh blanket of snow, unusual for summer, had fallen a few days before, dusting the higher ridges with white. Their camp was simple but sturdy, with a roaring fire at its heart. Arthur sat back in a folding chair, the heat from the flames warming his hands while the others recounted old stories about the forest. He'd heard them all before. Stories about hunters who had disappeared without a trace, strange sounds in the night, even sightings of impossibly large creatures. Arthur had read up on local legends before coming here. Cryptid forums often mentioned Maine as a hotspot for strange occurrences. There were rumors of massive wolves seen stalking the tree line, walking on 2 legs like men. A werewolf, some said. Others just called it a forest devil. Arthur hadn't believed in any of it, until now. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the usual rustling of animals in the underbrush. On the second day, though, things began to shift. They were tracking a deer in the early afternoon when they heard it, a low, guttural growl that stopped all of them in their tracks. Arthur froze, his shotgun gripped tightly. The sound wasn't like any animal he'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a wolf. It was deep, almost like a growl formed into words, and it came from somewhere just ahead behind the thick veil of snow-dusted pines. "What the hell was that?" one of his friends, Mike, whispered. No one answered. Arthur motioned for silence, his heart pounding as they edged forward. The growl came again, this time to their left. Whatever it was moving. Fast. Arthur caught a glimpse of something dark darting between the trees. It was too large to be a deer, too fast to be a bear, and its shape, it moved upright like a man, but with a loping, predatory gait. A sharp crack echoed through the forest as Mike fired his rifle into the trees. The noise rang out, but there was no sound of a hit. The creature, if it had been there, was gone. By the time they returned to camp, the group was on edge. The snow was falling again, soft but steady, coating the ground and muffling the forest's usual sounds. Arthur built the fire higher, the flickering flames casting long, twisting shadows against the dark. They sat in uneasy silence, listening. The snow made the forest almost unnaturally quiet. Then it came, a howl, distant but unearthly, rising and falling in a way that didn't sound quite animal. The hairs on Arthur's neck stood on end. He thought of his father then, the way he used to sit by the fire with a glass of whiskey, telling Arthur about the things people feared in the wild. "The forest doesn't care about you," his father had said once. "It doesn't play by the rules you think it does." The creature circled their camp for hours, its growls and heavy footsteps coming from different directions as if it were testing their defenses. Once, Arthur thought he saw its eyes. two faintly glowing orbs reflecting the firelight from the edge of the clearing. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they took turns keeping watch, weapons ready. Arthur thought about his mother, who had always told him to trust his instincts. Those instincts now screamed at him to leave, but there was nowhere to go in the dark. By dawn, the snowfall had eased, but the ground was slippery and uneven. They packed their gear quickly, each man moving with quiet urgency. The plan was to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead them back to the road. The forest felt heavier that morning, as if it were holding its breath. The first attack came just as they reached the creek. The creature lunged from the trees, a blur of dark fur and claws. It hit Mike hard, sending him sprawling into the icy water. Arthur raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the valley. The creature snarled and retreated into the trees, but not before Arthur saw its face, elongated with sharp, yellowed teeth and eyes that burned with an unnatural intelligence. It wasn't just an animal. It was something more. They pulled Mike from the creek, his leg torn and bleeding. He was alive but pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to keep moving," Arthur said, his voice tight. He took point, his shotgun raised, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The creature followed them, always just out of sight. They could hear it, its heavy steps crunching through the snow, its growls echoing between the trees. It was playing with them, Arthur realized, like a predator toying with its prey. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the group was battered and exhausted. Mike could barely walk, leaning heavily on Arthur for support. The town was just ahead, its rooftops visible through the thinning trees. But the creature made one last charge, bursting from the underbrush with a feral scream. Arthur turned and fired, the blast hitting the creature square in the chest. It stumbled, snarling, before retreating once again into the shadows. This time, it didn't follow. They reached the town just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. They didn't call the police. Who would believe them? Instead, they found a doctor for Mike and quietly left town the next day, leaving the forest and its secrets behind. Arthur knew he would never forget those eyes or the sound of the creature's growl. The forest had shown him something that didn't belong in his world, something ancient and untamed. And he knew, deep down, that it was still out there, waiting. The Montana air was crisp as Sylvester Crow pulled into the old gas station. The place looked like it had been patched together with rust and prayer. The single pump wheezed as he filled his tank, and the wind carried a biting chill that hinted at an approaching storm. Sylvester glanced at the mountains in the distance, their jagged peaks cloaked in gathering gray clouds. A storm was definitely brewing, and it would be a cold one. Sylvester wasn't new to unpredictable weather. Back in San Francisco, he'd learned to expect sudden changes. The city was a patchwork of microclimates, 1 minute sunny, the next shrouded in fog. That unpredictability mirrored his life as a police officer, always alert, always on edge. But out here in the vast Montana wilderness, the stakes felt different. The isolation was palpable and it left him uneasy. Inside the gas station, the air smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. The cashier, an older man with a craggy face, barely looked up from his magazine. Sylvester grabbed a candy bar and a bottle of water, exchanging the bare minimum of pleasantries before heading back to his car. He had planned to drive straight through to his destination, but the storm rolled in faster than expected. The wind howled, and rain pelted the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. Sylvester spotted a small pull-off near a cluster of trees and decided to wait it out. He parked, grabbed his jacket, and set up a small fire a few feet into the woods. The flames hissed as raindrops occasionally slipped through the branches above. As he waited, Sylvester's thoughts wandered to his brother, Marcus. Marcus had always been the family storyteller, spinning tales of monsters and legends when they were kids. One story had stuck with Sylvester, a shadowy creature that stalked its victims, toying with them before striking. It was just a game they'd played once, based on a creature from a video game they'd loved. But sitting here in the storm, with the wind carrying eerie whispers through the trees, Sylvester couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The first noise was faint, a branch snapping somewhere in the darkness. Sylvester tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt. He shone the beam into the woods, but the light was swallowed by the dense shadows. Another crack, this time closer. He stood, his muscles taut, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm but edged with unease. Silence. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a flash of something pale slipping behind a tree. He swung the flashlight, but there was nothing there. His mind raced. A deer? A coyote? But the shape hadn't moved like an animal. It had been upright. The firelight flickered, and the rain picked up, making it harder to hear. Sylvester crouched, feeding the fire more wood to keep it alive. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but distorted, as if it came from a broken throat. It sent a chill racing down his spine. He stood, drawing the hunting knife he kept in his bag. The sound came again, closer this time, and he realized with growing dread that whatever was out there wasn't afraid of him. He thought about the stories Marcus used to tell, and for the first time, he wished his brother was here to laugh it off and tell him he was overthinking. The thing in the woods circled him for what felt like hours. He'd catch glimpses of it. A pale figure, lanky and impossibly tall, darting between the trees. The growls turned into a mocking, guttural laughter like it was enjoying his fear. Sylvester's heart hammered as he backed toward his car, never taking his eyes off the tree line. Suddenly it emerged, just far enough for him to see its outline. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Sylvester's grip on his knife tightened. The creature didn't charge. It just stood there, swaying slightly, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Then it moved. Fast. Fast. Too fast. Sylvester stumbled backward, tripping over a root as the creature darted past him, close enough that he could feel the rush of air. It didn't attack. Instead, it disappeared into the woods again, leaving him panting and disoriented. It was playing with him, just like the stories. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning the fire and bolting for the car. The rain was a torrent now, and the wind howled like a living thing. He fumbled with his keys, his wet hands slipping, before finally getting the door open. He climbed in, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the woods, and for a brief second, he saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, its head cocked, watching him. Its pale skin glistened in the rain, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. Sylvester floored the gas pedal, the car skidding as it tore away from the pull-off. He drove for miles, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. His phone had no signal, and the storm made it impossible to call for help even if he wanted to. Finally, he reached a small diner on the outskirts of a town. He parked and sat there, shaking, before finally stepping inside. The waitress gave him a curious look as he ordered coffee, his clothes still soaked. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. Who would believe him? Instead, he stared out the window, watching the storm rage on, and wondered if the creature was still out there, stalking someone else in the darkness. He'd always thought Marcus's stories were just that, stories. But now, Sylvester wasn't so sure. Whatever was out there in the Montana woods wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was hunting.